Hey, it's Professor Wham. Going to be doing yet another blog here. This one hopefully will be a little shorter. It certainly won't be an hour and a half like the other one was, the last one. But this is one I've been wanting to do for a little while. Been prepping for it for a little while. A few weeks ago, I did a blog on the Tioga Canyon UFO contacts. And in that, I talked a little bit about Scott Rogo. And I also did another thing about Scott Rogo, actually, talking about his haunted planet or haunted universe, whatever it was. Haunted Universe, that's the name of the book. What I'm going to be talking about today is a reprint that was done by Anomalist a few years ago, a 2-volume reprint of the first book that Scott Rogo ever did on paranormal events or paranormal experience. And this particular book is called, and you'll see it here in a minute, I'll put it up on the screen. It's called, it's volume 1 and 2 of Paranormal Music Experiences. And the first volume is called A Casework of Otherworldly Music, and the second volume is called A Psychic Study of the Music of the Spheres. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of how this fits into what he did, his métier, as we say. So the name of this blog is D Scott Rogo's Auditory Wonders, Otherworldly Music, and Conversations Between Worlds. So as I've introduced him to you, he's probably best known now for his parapsychological work investigating out-of-body experiences. He has a very, very well-known book on that, and for his work with Ann Druffel on several noted UFO abduction and contact cases. When I was doing those books of his, and when I was reading him, I was unaware that he had also extensively researched the phenomena of unexplained music and other unusual audio perceptions that have been reported in connection with various paranormal and parapsychological experiences. Apparently, he was a trained musician. I did not know this. He was a trained musician, and this topic, as I mentioned, was the very first topic that he studied. He actually wrote a book, his first book, at the age of 19, and it was called Ned, N-A-D, Ned, A Study of Unusual Otherworldly Experience. Now, what is Ned? Ned, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a bit, it looks like an acronym, especially the way he uses it in this text. It's capital N-A-D, and so it looks like nod, because we're Americans and we don't know how to do our vowels. But it's actually pronounced Ned, and it comes from the Sanskrit. But what these two books indicate, the ones that Anomalist reprinted, is that at this early age, Rogo had amassed a multitude of cross-cultural material reports of unusual audio occurrences, many of which were perceived by multiple witnesses in diverse circumstances and which span many centuries. Some of them are quite ancient in the book. Some of them are in the Middle Ages, and they go right up to the period in which he was writing, so right through the 20th century. Now, these kinds of experiences are of special interest to me, and so I was particularly interested that he had done work in this area, because I've had many audio experiences, both by myself and with others, or at least with other beings, like my cats, for example. I rarely see things, per se. People like Jeffrey Pritchett, for example, they have a lot of visual experiences. I don't have that many visual experiences, but I've had a lot of audio experiences, including music, voices, and what I used to talk to Eugenia Macer's story about, audio apports, some of which have been noticed by other people. So I'm really interested in the audio aspect of this. And I probably am going to do a further blog down the line talking more specifically about some of the more interesting and bizarre audio apports that I've had. Now, Rogo in these books is mainly interested in the more musical phenomena. that he refers to as Ned. Now, what is Ned? Ned is a term from the Sanskrit that can be translated as cosmic flow or channel or music, and is often associated with sound, and is referenced in classical Indian yoga texts as being associated with the exalted states that yogis might achieve, with the opening of chakras or other energy centers of the body. He's not then referring to some of the more unusual sounds that have been reported more recently, such as the mysterious trumpet sounds or the humming sounds or booming noises that Linda Moulton Howe has been following, or the bizarre cries and screams associated most frequently with cryptids like Sasquatch, or some of the other sounds that I've heard that are connected to possible UFO sightings or hauntings. Although he does talk about some sounds connected to hauntings. Although all these different categories that I'm talking about of sound are quite interesting in their own right and for different reasons. So Scott is also, as I mentioned, not referring to other sounds that may accompany paranormal experiences or events, say odd rustling sounds or mechanical or electronic sounds that occasionally are associated with UFO reports, for example. He mentions but does not focus much on sounds that may accompany dreams. And I think part of the reason why he avoids that is because dreams have this obvious sort of subjective element to it, because what he wants to do is try to examine these audio sounds as a phenomenon in and of themselves that then can be subjected to certain types of analysis, the way parapsychologists do. So rather, Rogo focuses on Ned that seem to accompany near-death states or near-death experiences, some hauntings, out-of-body experiences, and he does spend some time looking at mystical and visionary experiences and the connection of Ned with those. Although when you actually read some of his examples, a lot of them do seem to transcend these categories. So he's trying to be, like parapsychologists try to be as scientific as possible in establishing different categories of Ned. Now, what his collection does demonstrate is that unusual musical or auditory experiences are universal in the sense that every culture and people report them, although the context will temper who hears what and in what circumstances. So how do this two volume set now that Anomalist reprinted, what's the dividing line between volume 1 and volume 2? Volume 1, the casebook of Otherworldly music, attempts to categorize the different kinds of musical or auditory phenomena by its seeming concurrence with other phenomena, such as near-death experiences, hauntings, out-of-body experiences, encountering mediums, or having mystical awakening. And he does have sort of a miscellaneous category of contexts. And just to remind you, this is the man himself right here, and this is probably the most famous book of his, Leaving the Body, A Complete Guide to Astral Projection. Scott Rogo apparently himself astrally projected quite a lot. That was something that he had a number of experiences about. And so that was part of his interest. And the books themselves, let me show you the books. These are the two books, the 2-volume set. So I've told you about volume 1. In volume 2, which is a psychic study of music of the spheres, what Rogo does is he takes these general categories and attempts to find commonalities between them, which could result in what Rogo hopes might be a general explanation for these experiences. So he basically collates these accounts and he subjects the data to some statistical analysis. The first thing that he attempts to do is he attempts to distinguish between parapsychological Ned and mystical Ned, which there are some differences, but it's not entirely clear. From his perspective, the former would be more objective and less subject to specific states of consciousness, although I'm not sure that some of the distinctions that he tries to draw in the book would necessarily hold water now. All right. And I'll give you an example here in a minute. In addition to correlating Ned with specific experiences, as mentioned above, such as near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and hauntings, Scott then examines his case files for the following: the type of music, whether people are hearing choral or instrumental music, the duration of the music, how long it lasts, obviously, the volume of the music, discernibility, whether there seems to be a definite melody and or a specific form of instrumentation or arrangement, and then its effect on the listener. Using these criteria, Scott concludes that in the largest percentage of cases, at least in his database that he's drawn, that involve musical sounds, that they seem to be of a mixed choral nature, and they start quietly, then crescendo in effect, and fade quickly out, although in some instances the crescendo fade dynamic may seem to pulse, so that it'll crescendo and fade, and then crescendo and fade, and then crescendo and fade. Now, for the most part, percipients are surprised and pleased by the music, which contains elements both familiar and quite distinct to the listener. In many cases that he talks about, individuals could perceive certain instruments, or they could perceive certain choral patterns. And in some instances, the music almost seemed a little familiar to them, but then they realized that they'd never heard that melody before, or it was unlike any melody that they'd ever heard, or the instrumentation or the choral quality was unlike anything that they'd ever heard before. Now, the vast majority of listeners report experiencing feelings of bliss, ecstasy, peace, or contentment when hearing Ned. None were frightened by the experience. Scott also discovered that the mystical experiences of Ned and the parapsychological experiences of Ned were more similar than different. So this is part of the reason why there was sort of an overlap between them. It was often hard for him to distinguish between the two, because a lot of times the parapsychological experience of Ned would lead to a mystical experience, you see. The difference was that the mystical experience of Ned often lasted longer than the latter. And in some individuals, because it was part of a visionary or mystical experience that was sort of an epiphenomenon of the spiritual exercises they were doing, there was more evidence of control in the experience. For the parapsychological experiences of Ned, there was more of a sense of wonderment and the unexpected. Although mystics and visionaries enjoyed their Ned, they were often more familiar with it, or at least with accounts of that experience. So although they still experienced the awe and bliss of otherworldly music, they had a frame of reference. Okay? So I'm going to go into this a little bit here. I did a little bit of research online, and this was actually a little bit more difficult than I thought it might be, because the mystical and visionary experiences of Ned are often considered to be highly esoteric experiences as a result of very esoteric practices. I did find a couple of yoga models of Ned. In other words, where Ned occurs. And Ned is the root of the Sanskrit term nadi, which of course, if you know anything about yoga, you know that the nadi are the channels through which the energy flows. What we would call chi. But there are different ways in which as the nadi flow, so the experiences of Ned are going to be a little bit different. And these were just a couple of models that I found that have to do, and this is specifically with different types of Raja Yoga or Kundalini Yoga. And this first one here on the left, if you're looking at the video, it shows the relationship, a kind of Venn diagram, if you will, of how yoga is connected to sound here and also to psychology. And it joins the bhakti devotional practices with the hatha yoga practices. But obviously, Raja Yoga and Kundalini Yoga can be part of this as well. But what it does is it shows the relationship between sound and breath and mantra, and where they all kind of join. So this is very, very similar to actually the model that Rogo was using. His basic argument is that for some reasons of proximity and person and circumstance, there are times and places and people that are particularly sensitive to, I don't know how else to put this, a thinning of the atmosphere, or a thinning of the veil, if you will, between our world and the unseen world. And that in a sense, when these moments happen, something on the other side notices this thinning and attempts to reach out to a person who is receptive. All right. And so there's a sense in which that thin membrane itself is a kind of, operates almost like a loudspeaker, or I guess you would call it like an eardrum, and it sort of causes a vibration that permits an individual to actually hear the vibrations of what is going on in another realm, as this energy or person or consciousness in the other realm is trying to connect with you. And that's, there may be places like in graveyards, for example. A lot of his examples, parenthetical examples, are examples of people who suddenly had this experience in the proximity of death, or in the proximity of a graveyard. And the supposition is that there may be some places where this membrane that separates our world and the other world is particularly thin. And so some people might be more receptive to this humming that's always going on, or this attempt by consciousnesses in the other realm to what's always going on. But the way he describes it is very similar, actually, to this diagram on the left, which I thought was interesting. Now, on the right, this is one possible diagram that I was able to get. Some of the diagrams are actually proprietary, and so I was unable to actually get permission to download them and use them. But because there are several different theories about this. But what the idea here is surrounding this is that one way in which to achieve the experience of Ned in the rising of the Kundalini is to very specifically do these yogic locks, doing a yogic lock at the forehead chakra, at the throat chakra, and then at the root chakra, which forces the energy up into the middle of the body in a way. And apparently and then you take that energy and you circulate it in that smaller place, and that can cause an explosion of Kundalini. And one of the signals that the Kundalini has been raised is the beginning of Ned, the beginning of experiencing these internal musical sounds, these internal musical tones. I've also had this experience, or have encountered some of these teachings in Vajrayana Yoga, where some of the seed syllables, if you achieve certain levels of circulation with Mahamudra, that you'll start hearing the tones of Hri, for example, in certain parts of your brain. I've actually had that experience. It's pretty intense. And even though he doesn't talk about this, what he is describing also corresponds very closely to the Sufi models of what's called La Taif. And what La Taif are practices, are zikr practices that are intended to move energy through the body in certain ways in order to activate the qalb, or the heart. And it's very similar to Kundalini, except that it's experienced somewhat differently. And because Kundalini, when it's eventually experienced, it's experienced, from the root chakra up. Whereas in the activating of the qalb in Sufism, it's experienced from the core of the heart outward, so that it encompasses everything. But these are some of the circulating patterns. And keep in mind, you have different schools of thought that have different ways of doing this. I was taught a method of La Taif from my imam that does not correspond perfectly with what you see on the left or on the right. But it really doesn't matter. The basic idea is that what you're trying to do is connect the different portions, the different energy centers, or sheaths as they're called in the body, to the expansive nature of the heart. And you do this through breathing exercises and through zikr, and eventually you'll have the experience of what's called fana, which is the physical body will feel as if it's become completely porous. It's not, some people call it dissolving because fana means annihilation, but fana is never understood to be, it's understood to be just an experience. It's not what's really happening or what's really going to happen to you. You know what I mean? It's just understood, you're basically liberating yourself from your attachment to the body, to the body's sheaths, so that you can experience the porous nature of a law of love sweeping through you. I have not had that experience to that degree, but I've had pieces of it, and it is very. It's not intense. It's actually very relaxing. It's not what you'd expect. Now, I've explained a little bit of Rogo's preferred explanation, and I'm not completely convinced by it myself. I think it's a little complicated, that parapsychological sounds are a result of this external correspondence that is trying to connect with you through the veil. And because the way that he describes it, the way that he explains it, as a kind of rebound of energy, it presupposes, for one thing, that the veil is over there somewhere, and that we're actually separate from it, which I don't think that we are. And it also depends, the way he describes it, on the existence of the etheric plane, which I think my own perception is that what we call the etheric plane is our description of something else, our description of a sense of separateness that in fact really doesn't exist. Basically, he seems to be only really interested in explaining the audio experiences of individuals that are close to death or that are having out-of-body experiences. And as he admits, one has to believe in the etheric plane anyway, and that consciousnesses are very removed from us for this theory to make sense. Now, I'll confess I'm not really that interested in explanations for Ned. I mean, if we come up with them, great. Because some audio sounds or music may be entirely subjective, only heard by the person, and yet remain completely meaningful and completely valid in terms of, one's own spiritual advance or experience, or what it gives to you. I mentioned the spiritual traditions as Raja Yoga and Sufism because both of these traditions maintain that internal sounds are just as important as anything that might be experienced externally, because both of these insist that the external-internal division really doesn't exist. So, I don't necessarily believe that all the things I've heard have been objective sounds in the sense that others would have perceived the same thing or anything at all. However, I was fascinated by the examples he was able to collect, and I'll give a couple of examples below. These are both examples that one is taken each from each volume. So the first example was through a personal communication by a man named Ross Braley, who had written him from Ozark, Missouri. And this was a personal experience that this guy had. And he said, years ago, around 1930, I was doing some door-to-door work for a small publishing concern. And I was in a small town, either in Oklahoma or Kansas. It was necessary to walk across a cemetery or go a block around to some steps in order to get where he needed to go. My mind was not on anything unusual, when suddenly, as I was crossing the cemetery, I both seemed to hear and feel the most beautiful singing. It seemed to be a choir or an audience singing songs of praise, such as church audiences do. However, I did not recognize any earthly song I had ever heard. It was of a nature I find hard to describe. It was beautiful, no false strains or chords, blending perfectly in harmony and with a perfect ethereal tone I had never heard before. It seemed rather distant, yet near. I felt it and I heard it. It's interesting. I felt it and I heard it. I stopped and listened for a time. I walked slowly out of the cemetery and it seemed to fade and disappear. There were no earthly tunes I could recognize. They were more beautiful and perfect than any I had ever heard before. And the second one is a woman, Rinkowski, reporting from Brooklyn, New York, and her experience was connected to the death of a beloved relative. She said, about 3 years ago, my Aunt Selma passed on. She had been ill for some time with terminal cancer. Since we were all very close to her, especially me, for I was her favorite niece and she my favorite aunt, she came to live with us for some time after the doctors let her come out of the hospital. She had wanted to spend her remaining time with relations that she loved. The few months she had left flew by rather quickly as we all tried to bring her into her life some remaining happiness. One day in early September, I felt acutely sad. Some part of me must have known that Selma would not be with us very much longer. As I brought her lunch up the stairs, I suddenly felt a rush of very warm air, the type you feel in the nice days of early spring. As I stood on the landing just a few feet from her door, I was startled to hear faint strains of beautiful music that came from her room and dwelt lightly in the hall where I was. I opened the door, and I was sure then, as I am now, that Selma was seeing something I could not, even though I did hear the music. As I stood, even more spellbound than anything else, Selma turned her head in my direction and smiled the most peaceful and happy smile I have ever saw. Her head fell lightly back on the pillow, and I knew that she was gone. Now, as mentioned above, I've had many interesting audio experiences, some of which I'll share in a subsequent blog at some time. But for the purposes of this entry, I can say that I've had the definite Ned experience, as Rogo defines and describes it twice, that I can easily recall. The first occurred back in 2000, the year 2000, only days after I'd found my partner dead of a stroke. That same week, the Sufi community in Kansas City was celebrating Rumi's Urs. In Sufi traditions, the anniversary of someone's death, what in the Jewish tradition is called the yahrzeit of a person, is celebrated as their return to the source of all being, their Urs. Many Sufi communities celebrate the Urs of Rumi, who died on December 17, 1273, by the Western calendar. The Kansas City community has long held dances, whirling, semad, zikr, and meditation practices on a weekend close to that date as a commemoration of Rumi's life and affairs. So I attended all the events that year because I was bereft and really messed up, as you can imagine. During the extended sema on the last evening, while doing zikr, I suddenly heard a range of singing that I'd never heard before. We were doing these practices at an old-style wooden Episcopal church, St. Mary's, in Kansas City, Missouri, and I thought that perhaps members of the church choir had joined us, because occasionally members of the congregation would participate with our devotions. I looked up to where the choir seats were located, and no one was there. All of a sudden, it was like the ceiling lifted up and I could distinctly hear other voices singing above and beyond our own, with harmonies and descants that we didn't use. This was not an echo because the pitches were both higher and lower and more resonant than our voices could probably physically achieve. Now, it sounds very bizarre, but it was as if the heavens had opened and the voices of creation were singing with us, supporting everything we were doing. I was seized with this intense desire and energy to begin whirling myself, which is not something I do because normally I will fall down and possibly throw up. So I started to whirl, first to the left and then to the right. Whirling is normally something that one has to develop, to build up the stamina towards, because it changes the circulation of the cerebral spinal fluid and affects the middle ear. Whirling without knowing how to do it can make one really sick. But somehow I whirled for the first and only time of my life for almost 30 minutes. I was in a state of ecstasy I've never experienced before, and I heard the singing the whole time. I also got a headache afterwards, and I couldn't sleep very well for about 3 days because every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the music and see the light it came from. Now, I'm willing to accept that my openness to this experience at this time was due to my grief and trauma. At the same time, my experience is referenced fairly regularly in Sufi literature, so it's not that unusual in that regard. I do know that it changed me and helped me get through that difficult time in my life. My other distinct experience of Ned occurred in the late spring of 2013, 3 years after I'd moved to the mid-Hudson Valley. A series of thunderstorms had moved through earlier in the evening, and there was just a bit of wind and scattered showers remaining. It was about 9:30 p.m., not long after full dusk. I was sitting up in bed with the window open, letting the fresh, rain-washed air blow into my room because it had gotten quite warm and muggy that day. I could hear frogs outside and the beginning of spring insects, so I just wanted to listen and relax. The music began faintly, and at first I thought that neighbors down the way or behind us were playing music outside. It sounded sort of like pipes and flutes, although I know that's going to evoke images of either Lovecraft or fairy lore, depending on one's predilections. But seriously, that's just exactly what it sounded like. For a bit, I dismissed it, but then the sounds began to get a little louder, and I realized the melodies were nothing I could recognize. The sounds almost had a call and response pattern to them. They would crescendo quickly and die down, almost as if in pulses or waves. They were very pleasant, although also a little creepy. The music got so loud that I finally went outside and walked around the house, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. At last I realized they were coming from above or all around. So I just stood out in the backyard and listened to this enticing, beguiling music. Now, interestingly, no one else seemed to be outside listening. No neighbors came out, no cars passed, and in fact, the entire neighborhood seemed to go quite still. Even the frogs stopped when the music was at its loudest. Eventually, it seemed to dissipate, as if it was traveling away to its next location. I went back inside, a little creeped out, but completely fascinated. Over the next week, I did a little discreet investigation and asked a few of my neighbors as I ran into them whether they'd heard anything themselves that night. And I was surprised to discover that 2 neighbors had heard something musical, but had chosen not to investigate because they were involved with other things at the time, and they assumed they were hearing something from down the street, just like I had initially. Now, I didn't elucidate further on what I'd heard with them, but was relieved that others had heard something. Now, it is possible that I was hearing some kind of phenomenon associated with the weather, although I've been through many thunderstorms and have never heard anything remotely like I heard that night, so we'll just have to leave it at that. Now, D Scott Rogo's investigation into paranormal music is interesting primarily due to the vastly different examples he's collected into one place. The experience of Ned is attested widely in religious and mystical literature, but has rarely been examined at all, at least to my knowledge, probably because most skeptics would argue that there's no way to objectively quantify it or remove it from the possible realm of imagination. That being said, the universality of the experience can also speak to the importance of music and sound generally as a conveyor of meaning and significance. I know many people, including myself, who have had the experience of hearing and ascertaining beautiful music while dreaming and being bitterly disappointed when the music fades upon awakening. I can't tell you how many times I've had that experience. At the very least, these experiences may point to a level of creative endeavor that many individuals latently possess, or a pre-verbal form of communication with deeper and higher levels of consciousness. Now, even Nietzsche, the arch-atheist, declared that the conclusion of a melody is not the point of a song, but without its conclusion, neither is the point of the melody achieved either. He referred to that fact as a parable about music. He also admitted that music alone brought him to the point where he could actually believe there might be something greater than himself. So even he was entranced by music. So I wanted to say a little bit more about Scott Rogo because I know that in a previous blog I said I would go a little bit more into his biography. So this particular book comes out of the very first text that he ever wrote on parapsychological topics and paranormal topics. He wrote over 30 titles, of which only maybe, I don't know, a dozen maybe are still available somewhere. He was an interesting man. He was openly gay among individuals who knew him, and at the time of his death had been involved with studying how various spiritual practices might help people who were suffering from AIDS. He died in 1990. And he was apparently preparing a book on that topic. I didn't know that when I started doing research about him. It might be part of the reason why Ann Druffel had him sit in on the Tioga Canyon cases, because the women in those cases were lesbian and queer. His last public service was his regular time volunteering on a community AIDS hotline. And he was last seen on August 14th, 1990, by his neighbor when he returned from volunteering on an AIDS hotline. And then at some point between August 14th and August 15th, it's not clear exactly when, Scott Rogo was stabbed to death in his home by an unknown assailant. At first, robbery appeared to possibly be the motive, but there are obvious questions about his murder that will probably remain forever unanswered. He wasn't found until August the 16th. An early suspect, Juan Batista, who was an acquaintance of Rogo's and who seemed to have, at least according to the police, a possibly shady background, was initially charged with the crime. And he went to trial twice due to procedural difficulties, was convicted, and then exonerated by the judge because the bloody fingerprints at the crime scene did not match his own, apparently. So Rogo's murder is unsolved and the case is still open. So it's like one of those bizarre cases. So his life ended far too soon. There is no way of knowing how much he might have contributed to paranormal and parapsychological research had he not been killed. And I consider his paranormal music experiences books to be very interesting. If you're interested with this kind of experience, because like I said, most people haven't really investigated it, but interesting sounds and music often come up in certain types of paranormal or parapsychological experiences. It might be an interesting couple of volumes for you to check out. It certainly was interesting to me, and I'll certainly be using them as references, even though I don't quite agree with his theory. That doesn't really matter. You know, you can start out where somebody you can start with where somebody has gone and then go on from there and do your own things. In the notes and in the description for this video and for this blog, I will include a link that gives a little bit more information and has a link to a YouTube video that or audio that does exist, where you can hear Scott Rogo talking about some of his parapsychological examinations. There are a couple of examples of him on that were recorded that have survived on YouTube. So I'll be providing that. There is also an extensive biography of him on a website that is called extempore.com. And I'm not going to give you the link for that. I'm just going to tell you what it is, extempore.com. The reason I'm not going to give you the link is because the link actually has a bad banner ad in it that is malware, which my computer was able to seize and sequester, but you may not be so lucky. And so you can look that up at your own risk. But I'm not going to just put the link. I'll tell you about it, but I'm not just going to put the link in here because I don't want people to go to it on their phone and then have their phone be compromised. So, but there is a better biography of him out there somewhere. So if you have the firewall and the virus protection to read it, you can go to that. It's called extempore. Like extemporaneous, so it's extempore.com, and it's extempore.com. But in any case, so this wraps up what I'm going to be looking at with Scott Rogo at this time. Like I said, in a subsequent blog, I will probably do something about my sounds, some of the sounds that have been important to me. That have signaled to me important indicators of the presence of entities or the exchange of worlds or internal states of exaltation, because I've had a lot of those. So in any case, check Scott Rogo out. He's a very interesting dude.